Goal 10 calls for reducing inequalities. So reducing inequalities in income, as well as inequalities based on age, sex, disability, and so forth. And there are many forms of inequality. I'm going to be focusing on the link between all of these different types of inequality and political inequality. Because I believe there is a very significant link, and there's actually been research for decades that demonstrates an important link between political exclusion and various forms of inequality. And there are a lot of different approaches to reducing these types of inequalities. So one of the conditions that produces these types of different types of inequality is political exclusion. And one of the ways of addressing this is by giving people a greater say in decisions that affect their lives, giving people spaces to be able to express their interests, to be able to assert themselves as political actors. So spaces for people who have traditionally been excluded from politics and from civil society to be able to express their interests and be political actors. So essentially improving the quality of democracy. And that's what I look at in my own research. I look at participatory democracy, particularly in Latin America. So I'm just going to ask you to think about for a moment, what does democracy actually mean to you? Because it is an essentially contested concept, meaning it's a concept the very nature of which has always been and will always be contested. Usually Western people, citizens, generally tend to use a liberal understanding of democracy because that's what we've always been taught. So political rights, economic rights in the sense of being able to consume and purchase and sell things, but not economic rights in terms of socioeconomic equality, and not really a lot of social rights either. So when I ask people in rural communities in Latin America, and a lot of the communities I work with are indigenous or Afro-descendant, you get a very different response when I ask people about what democracy means to them, and it tends to be much more linked to having a voice, being able to participate in things that affect their lives, and even things like dignity is one of the responses I get, just being treated with dignity by state institutions. And then sometimes, because I've also taught classes in public universities, and among some of the students, sometimes they'll talk about social revolution and that kind of thing. And in fact, I've even been asked by students if I could help plan a social revolution. And usually, not that I'm not sympathetic, but I usually try, and I've never been asked that by students at the University of Alberta, I have to say. So what does democracy actually mean? So demos, the people, and kratos, rule. So the idea that the people rule, it's a system, in theory at least, in which the entire population, and that's the origins of the idea of democracy, the entire population is able to rule through direct participation. So obviously not the type of system that we actually have in place, even though we call our political system a democratic one. Most of you probably know democracy it was conceived in ancient Greece, in Athens, in around 500 BCE. And since then, there have actually been two streams of democratic thinking. One, which is sort of what has evolved into the liberal stream, which is that you can't give people too much power for various reasons, either because they don't know what they're doing, they're stupid, they're lazy. And that was actually a position that was taken up to an extent by Plato, who was a contemporary, who kind of said, well, you can't just let any old Dimitri or Costas, steer the ship. It has to be the society's greatest minds, right? Our philosopher kings. So the smartest people should be in charge. And I guess if anything, we've kind of moved in the opposite direction. But the other stream is that no, people are capable of making decisions about their lives, but they may not. The reason they may not be able to make the best decisions, or the reason they may appear to be apathetic, is because of the opportunities are not there. So what kind of democratic system do we have? Liberal democracy, what is it? So control, and when I go through some of these, think about how equality fits in, because it doesn't really. So the basic tenets of our system: control over government decisions is constitutionally vested in elected officials. These elected officials are chosen and removed in elections. Most adults have the right to vote, freedom of expression. Most people have access to different sources of information, and there is a right to join and form associations. So all of those are good things, but none of those actually require any sort of participation with respect to citizens, and most of them also don't really allow to tackle inequality. In fact, they often just reproduce inequalities. So freedom of expression is a good thing, but not everybody has the same freedom to express themselves because not everybody has the same resources. And any kind of political participation, as I'm often told by some of the people that I've worked with, is based on resources. So some people have more than others and are able to participate more effectively than others. So democracy, liberal democracy, was progressing throughout most of the Second World War period. In the early 1990s, many of you probably heard there was a book that came out that was about the end of history, Francis Fukuyama, where the thesis was, now that the Soviet Union has collapsed, we're simply going to move towards more and more democratic regimes. That's, the end of history being the end of all of these conflicts. Everybody's going to eventually become democratic. I'm simplifying a little bit. And even at the time, some people thought that was a bit optimistic. I can assure you nobody thinks that anymore, that we're moving in that direction. But in any case, the liberal model that our political systems are based on tends to assume that if people have the same political rights on paper, that they're equal, and that all they need to do is sort of pick themselves up and get to work. I think most of us probably, that's not reality. Even when everybody has the same rights on paper, there are all kinds of factors that do lead to exclusion, and these can be identity, gender, and so forth. So, from the 1990s onward, and this is why I really became interested in studying Latin America, what we saw in that region, and in some other regions of the Global South, were efforts to innovate, so democratic innovation. And so we've seen from the 1990s onward participatory democracy mechanisms sort of spring up in most countries in Latin America, some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and in places like Kerala in India. And I think for me this is really interesting because countries of the North, the global North, like to teach or think they have something to teach to countries of the South about democracy. There are all kinds of funds and programs set up in Canada and in the US in particular to sort of teach people in the South how to run their governments, how to be more democratic. And I mean, some of these programs are generally well-intentioned, although they tend to operate from a position that assumes the universality of Western conceptions of democracy. Others are not particularly well-intentioned, and they have a very clear political agenda behind them, which is not promoting democracy, even though it's disguised that way. But while our system functions in Canada, it functions relatively well in terms of providing stability and political rights. It hasn't really changed a lot. I mean, we're essentially working with the same political system, a 19th century political system, essentially. There hasn't been a lot of innovation, and many would argue that it's not really built to respond to some of the needs of the 21st century. But what we're seeing in countries of Latin America is democratic innovation. There's a sort of a guru of participatory democracy called Arnstein of who's actually said that the center of democratic innovation has moved from north to countries of the south. None of which is to say that these experiments are perfect, and I don't want to romanticize them, but there are some very interesting things happening in terms of reducing inequalities. And much of this is actually happening in marginalized communities, so people who have never participated politically before other than maybe voting. And I think we have a lot to learn from this. So what am I actually talking about when I talk about participatory democracy mechanisms? There's quite a bit of variation between different countries. But there's also, there are also some common principles of participatory design, and we're not really familiar with this because we don't really see this much in Canada. There have only been a couple of cases in Canada. So essentially what I'm talking about is local level institutions, community councils that are government sanctioned but generally launched in individual neighborhoods by citizens and that have actual decision-making powers and control of at least some of the local budget and have their decisions are binding or can be binding. And these generally then would be sort of at the top of the so-called ladder of participation. Came out in the 1960s, this diagram by somebody called Arnstein of Participation, where, you know, at the very bottom it's just token participation, like we often see in universities, where somebody, you know, will say, here, we're going to consult you on decisions that we've already made, all the way to the top of the ladder, which is, you know, people actually have a say in what happens. And so we're seeing at least some of these participatory mechanisms closer to the top of the ladder. Probably the most well-known example is the participatory budgeting process in Brazil, but there are others as well. So I actually conducted a comparative study of 15 participatory democracy mechanisms across four different countries, I should know this, to sort of look at to what extent are they actually producing the kinds of results that proponents of participatory democracy hope they'll produce in terms of reducing inequalities and providing people with a greater sense of empowerment, and under what circumstances do some succeed and others fail, because again, I think we have a lot of lessons to learn from that. So I ended up interviewing something like 500 participants over the course of a couple of years, and I was looking at Chile, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Bolivia. In terms of who participates, it's actually overwhelmingly people from poor socioeconomic sectors, which actually is contrary to a lot of the literature from the global north, which suggests that people who participate in civil society are generally middle class. Also a lot of women. In most cases, more than half of the participants are women. And this actually does support a lot of the other studies that have been done. So these are good things. And what I found is generally positive results in two areas. So the first, more equitable distribution of public resources and services. So generally neighborhoods, for example, that didn't have access to basic services, electricity, water, because municipal governments, which were controlled by elected officials, were always sort of, you know, pushing all of the money towards wealthier neighborhoods. So we see, and not just in my own research, but in a lot of the Brazilian research as well, in many cases we see poor neighborhoods actually getting services and resources that they didn't before because people are actually able to decide themselves. And also what are sometimes called spillover effects in the literature, which I don't necessarily like the term because it makes them sound secondary. But the idea here is that people developing a greater sense of empowerment, a greater sense of political efficacy, because they're actually learning through participating in these mechanisms. They're learning about how things work, about where they need to go to get these things done, about how to develop budgets, how to develop proposals. And they're learning these skills and these things that they had not been exposed to before. And this was particularly pronounced among women as well. So, I'm just finishing an article now, many of the women kind of saying, you know, I never wanted to participate even locally because municipal, you know, governments, it's mostly men, and they would treat us like children. And through participating in these local mechanisms, you know, now I feel that I have a bit more confidence and that kind of thing. I bring my daughters. And so we actually saw a greater increase in terms of political efficacy among women than among men. And in some of the cases, the confidence has actually led people to become involved in civil society beyond these mechanisms. So those are good things. Again, I don't want to sort of romanticize these things. There was certainly variation, and you know, some work better than others. In terms of some of the factors that determine success and the lessons to be learned, for women and for Indigenous people or Afro-descendant people, the more participation there was, the more confident they felt. So, and this aligns a lot with a lot of the literature as well, which says usually when we're dealing with traditionally marginalized people, there's a certain threshold of participation. If you reach that threshold, people will feel more confident. But also things like written procedures to ensure that everybody has a voice, that everybody has time to talk, the types of voting mechanisms that are put in place, and specific measures to promote inclusion. And so there are, I think, practices that we're seeing in some of these participatory mechanisms in rural and poor urban communities in Latin America that can become design principles. And so basically my argument is that properly designed participatory mechanisms can give people a voice to help redistribute public goods and services. We've had a few cases here in Canada. They tend to be pretty pathetic by comparison. So this is why I think we do have a lot to learn, again, even though not perfect, but we do have a lot to learn from democratic innovation in the Global South. I think certainly in places like Edmonton, where there is so much inequality, that we need to think about ways of being able to get people who have traditionally been marginalized involved in decisions that affect their lives, and look at some of these experiments in the Global South and realize that we have as much to learn, if not more, than we have to teach all. So thank you.